Alison's kind of been this kind of conversation partner for me theologically and ecclesiologically, and we hadn't met till fairly recently, Alison, but we've certainly not had the chance to have a longer conversation. So I was really looking forward to today to sort of meet with somebody who's been really significant for me and my theological thinking. Yeah, so this report, New Things, was a piece of research conducted between November 22 and June 23, and we worked with 11 dioceses in the Church of England, and we asked them about new things, and that language is quite important, the new things that have been started in their diocese. What's happening, what language is being used, how are these new things functioning within each of those dioceses? And really there were sort of, in the executive summary, there's four sort of areas of finding. The first one is that there's lots of new things. So we from these 11 dioceses, there were about 900 new things that had been started. We found that 89% of them were somehow integrated into the existing parish system. We can say a bit more about that later. And the anecdotal evidence is that generally these things were seen quite positively. They felt to be things that were bringing life and joy. They were growing, was the other word that was used. And only 5 out of the 900 things were in the Catholic tradition within the Church of England. Second area was around new language, and we talked about what we call a new sort of espoused theology in the Church of England, which is each of these dioceses used what we called a main descriptor to describe these collection of new things. How do you make sense of them? And what's interesting about that is none of them used the word church. There were words used like new worshiping communities, new congregations, and only one of those terms that was used, these main descriptors, was rooted in what we'd say sort of rooted in historic Anglicanism, in the formularies of the Church of England. The third area was around resourcing churches. So you said I'm part of a resourcing church. I should say I'm a church which has been designated resourcing church. Whether we're doing it or not is for other people to judge, but we've been designated one. But yeah, 40 new resourcing churches across these 11 dioceses. 8 out of the 11 were putting quite a lot of time and energy and money into new resourcing churches. And then the fourth area was around pioneers and planters, and it was just interesting to see the way in which the language of pioneering was not used very much by these 11 dioceses, which we feel is sort of a shift from, say, the Mission Shaped Church report and Fresh Expressions to sort of where we are now. There's more of a focus on planting. And the point is that we reflected theologically on these findings, and you can read about that in the report. Why did it gain a lot of traction? I was on holiday like you, Josh. I came back to missed calls from Radio 4 and The Times and The Guardian. So I felt I missed my moment in the spotlight. But yeah, the language of church was the thing that really, that people picked up on. Is the Church of England dropping the word church because of an agenda, which, it was up to people to judge as to why they might have done that. But that was the thing that really, really interested people.
Yeah, thank you, Will. And Alison, unlike myself and Will, apparently you weren't on holiday when all of this hit the press, because we heard you give have a really interesting conversation with Dave Mail from the Church of England on Radio 4. I sent out a link to that interview in the invitation email. One of the things that's really striking about what you say in your write-up of that interview on the Save the Parish website, but also on Radio 4, is that you say that new things are operating in parallel to the parish system. I'm paraphrasing you here. And then you say this raises a really important question. Is there a crisis in Anglican ecclesiology? So let me invite you to say a little bit more about those comments, particularly about the parallel nature of new things. And then why do you think this might raise the question of a crisis?
Well, as Will indicated, the report got such notice because it was all about what are the new things. And I would have said the crisis of ecclesiology is already there within the vision and strategy ideal, because it wants to have 10,000 separate, independent, new worshipping communities to parallel the parish system. And as the established Church of England, our churches are inclusive, open to everyone. They offer the cure of souls, sacraments, occasional offices, recognised liturgies. Now, the dioceses in the report are all too aware that the new things they might be doing don't necessarily measure up to this. Hence, only 6 of them use the descriptor worship to describe what they do. But of course, to get SDF money as was, they have to promise scores of new worshipping communities. I think this is a bit of a problem for them. And I think we need new things. And I'm going to be very wide in what new things are, because I think they should be really, really wide. And in fact, I've been planning one at the cathedral myself. So, I'm not against new things. In fact, I hope I have a missional heart. But the problem is when they become separate, atomized, and cut off from the local church. So the example I gave on the Sunday programme is typical of somebody trying to do it in an orthodox way. So a church gets SDF money to start a new thing. It mounts a free food event for families with craft activity and a prayer time. It's a great initiative. But then a parishioner who helps starts giving out leaflets inviting people to a Mothering Sunday service in the church and gets into awful trouble, told the food event is the new church. There's no porosity here between whatever this is, this new thing, and the church. Well, the new thing has its own integrity as an outworking of the local church, reaching new people, perhaps even becoming a new congregation, which I noticed 7 of the dioceses used. But without that true connectivity of liturgy orders and a relation to the whole, it's not Anglican. And so bishops' mission orders are being stretched to the limit to kind of cover this lack. But as in Manchester, where the whole diocese is under one, there's often no consultation with the existing local clergy. And those leading the new things often do not have close relationships with the local clergy or pray with them. And the Archbishop of Canterbury is quoted as saying, we plant churches, that's what we do. And yes, we always have done. But I'd say we evangelize and serve. We bring people to Christ. And ecclesially speaking, we as the local church are part of that gospel we proclaim. So why should we seek to be vociferous, which is the ecclesiology of the free churches, and one factor in their steeper decline? New things are varied, but ecclesially they should be integrated at the local level through the principles of the one body, koinonia, and the mixed ecology, which means mutuality, interdependence. So what we've not done in the past is baptize any mission initiative as a church. And I think that comes out of the mission-shaped church kind of agenda, which you were saying we've moved on from, but in some ways not. So people are kind of struggling to do incredibly good things, but having to call them a church, or in the case of Will's report, moving against that. And I don't see why they should have to be a church. That's my point, that they need to be creative, they need to be outgoing, but you shouldn't be trying to force them into that, because if you do, then you reify them in this parallel sense. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Alison. Well, I wonder if I could give you opportunity to respond to any of the points that Alison's made there, things that you want to pick up on.
Well, I mean, just say, first of all, some of it's going to come out in, I think, later on in the conversation around there's different ecclesiologies at play, aren't there? And how the Church of England makes sense of differing ecclesiologies, a more, say, evangelical ecclesiology to more Catholic ecclesiology, and how they sit together, and the sort of theological instincts that are at play there is part of this, isn't it? But I mean, what was interesting about the report for me was this point that most of these things existed within the parish structure. And I guess this would be your point, Alison, that the question is, why do we feel the need to designate these things churches, to see them as distinctive things? I remember very early on in the Fresh Expressions movement talking to a particular bishop who said, we've always been doing Fresh Expressions. My granddad did Fresh Expressions. I think that the challenge for the Church of England was how do we sort of give life to this kind of missional impetus, this missional energy, in a way that kind of can go round or sidetrack the sort of the necessities of parish life and the parish structure. And I've got a lot of empathy for that, a lot of sympathy, but there's a question of how we do that really well as one body, which is the question that I'm really, really interested in.
And if I may be slightly provocative, it's helpful that the both of you have written things about this, so I can stir the pot slightly. I think in your book, Will, you ask a really important question, which puts pressure on some of what Alison's saying here. So you ask, let me read to you from it, if in case you've forgotten your own question. But Will, you ask in your book, so Will in his book explores this theme of place and the ways in which that's played out within our ecclesiology, particularly within Anglicanism. And you ask this question, might it not at least be possible that our longing for place will lead us to question as much as to embrace the current system we find? Might there even be a drive for us to embrace other non-parochial forms of church? So you talk about non-parochial forms of church, not just non-parochial forms of mission. Can I invite you to say a bit more about what you mean there? About should we be? Does our longing for place push us beyond the system as we have it?
Yeah, a lot to answer there, I think. I mean, again, just to acknowledge that we might be working with different ecclesiologies, and to acknowledge, our understanding what a church is, a definition is obviously really key. For me, the key thing that book was really around what is the relationship between the parish system, the structure as we have it, which is lines on a map, the historical inheritance, the parish churches, all of that, the structures, the resourcing that is so deeply ingrained, and the parish ideal, or the theology around the parish. And I see that parish ideal really as a longing to be close, to be present, close to our communities, not attractional churches in the sense of dispersed communities, but close and rooted. And for me, the key language there was all around place. But the problem is that there's not necessarily an immediate mapping up of those two things, that the sort of longing for place and where people exist in place and the way place functions isn't necessarily by necessity the parish structure as we have it, the lines on the map. So I explored how place functions for people. Place is a complex thing. The way people relate to place isn't necessarily those lines that, as I say, are drawn on the map. So I think what I was arguing in the book really is the longing for place is a good thing, but it might just be that parish structure isn't necessarily the thing that's going to fulfill that. And I think we need to reimagine the parish. And really, in the book, I was arguing that the thing, the ideal, and the thing are not necessarily the same idea. So we need to reimagine the parish for our time. And I was quite clear that I don't think that looks like throwing the baby out with the bathwater at all. That would be not a good way to receive our tradition and receive our inheritance. But likewise, it's not just to continue to do exactly as we've done. So we need to reimagine. And for me, that leaves space, the possibility that there's a way of engaging with place in a deeply parochial way, which looks like starting new churches that don't have a parish boundary in the same way that we imagine parish churches had to or received up to now. And that's probably what I meant by non-parish church forms. So it's that reimagining for me. That's the critical question.
Yeah, thank you. Alison, is there anything you want to pick up from Will's comments about the place of non-parochial churches?
I agree that place and the parish, in fact, is an imagined community in the way that Benedict Anderson said nations were. And there has to be that element where the only way, and I also think that often parishes do not necessarily reflect their communities, though I think a lot of that has to do with A, secularization, B, the paucity of clergy and resources compared to, I think John Inge said about your book that, resource churches can be more connected to their communities. When I say, well, yes, if you've got an associate minister, a children's worker, a kind of, you're going to be going out and more connecting than the traditional parish. But I think there is a value that the parish ideal is not just a commitment to place, it's a commitment to being placed, to accepting the incarnational thing of where you are and deliberately not choosing, and parish being an ideal of where you integrate all your subjective kinds of belongings and accept your givenness. And although I would agree that we need new churches, say, on estates, and it might be that we'll build them from below by somebody living there in an incarnational way and building that up, that I don't want place to become a purely subjective choice, because that's the whole point, that it isn't something that, you're stuck there. You know, you're stuck with these people in this place, and whether you're someone who's just moved there as a migrant, or whether you're somebody who's been on an estate where your family have been for yonks, there is a particular theological value in that I'm reluctant to give up.
Yeah, I think for me the question is what are we pursuing is the question. I guess what I was arguing in the book was, let's pursue everything you've spoken about there, Alison, around presence in place. Yes, incarnation, all of that being placed, I see is critically important. Chesterton's thing about you can't love a nation, you love your back garden thing. But the question, if that's what we should be pursuing, is my argument, rather than pursuing the continuation of the parish system as though that were an end in itself. And in lots of places, although the parish system needs to stay exactly as it is, in other places, pursuing the parish ideal, in other words, pursuing coverage, that's what I think often it's about, resourcing across coverage, is hurting the deaneries, is hurting dioceses, because we're spreading resources too thinly, whereas a much more sort of joined up approach where we could think about having maybe larger churches for a bigger area, for example. And in in the book, I deliberately am not giving clear answers, but I'm raising the question. Pursuing the parish system, I think, is problematic.
I think, though, that all the evidence shows that this kind of policy of putting people together and cutting is actually a policy of decline. I agree that we have limited resources at the moment, but I think there were reasons for that, and I think it is a bit of a kind of doom spiral that we've got ourselves into, which is partly because we don't value what we have, that it's dismissed too often as a failed project. Inherited church is a term of abuse in many places. And I think you won't evangelize like that. You can only evangelize from a position of confidence and trust. And although everything is against us at the moment, I think we really only can have that trust as, if we're going to have successful evangelism. But I agree, there are very, very difficult questions, and they're probably not what you want in this discussion, Josh. So I'll start
No, and there's a much longer conversation to have, isn't there, about the place of parish? It's not something we're going to solve in 15 minutes. And I commend both of the books from our speakers that I've already mentioned, because I think they both ask some really important questions about the place of parish for today. But I wonder if we can turn our attention back to the report, and we've talked already about the language of worship, of congregation, of church, of community. And Will's report, I think, does a real service to the church in pointing out that there is a lack of common language in the Church of England at the moment around the things we start. And Will, I just want to give you the opportunity to say a little about. Obviously, this is a descriptive piece of research in one sense, that this is just what's happening in these contexts. But I wonder if you could just fill in some of the context for us. Why do you think it's happening that we suddenly have this explosion of terms and we can't find a kind of common terminology?
Well, I think that's maybe overstating it. I think what happened, we use this language of main descriptors. Each of these dioceses were trying to find a way of holding coherence in mixed multiplicity. So there's these different things happening. How do we sort of find a way of holding them together? And I think on it, the ironic thing for me often was talking to lots of these individuals in the diocese. They had in mind the sort of, I guess, more Catholic wariness around some of the looseness of the language, and we're actually trying to include. So I think they were wary of some of your critiques, probably, Alison, of calling things church, which might not have measured up to what we would think a church is. And so actually to call them, well, these are new worshiping communities, or they're on their way to becoming a church or something. But I really don't, I didn't think that what was going on was that the word church was being dropped. And we talked about a new espoused theology, so I think it's important to reflect on the language. I think that is a significant shift. I really do. But I didn't see what I think the journalists were trying to make out of it, which was that, the Church of England, for some agenda, were trying to drop church or think that church is insignificant. And it was funny actually to see one's report. So there's what you write and then it's how it's read. And it's quite an interesting experience for me to read the way that it was used in the media.
Yeah, it's fascinating that relationship with what's read and what's written. And I think actually my read on your research, Will, was actually was similar, that actually in some respects you might think this ambiguous language is actually trying to take the church more seriously, not less seriously, because we want to make sure that if we call something a church, that it's a church, and not just label everything church. There's a time at which it seemed like we're putting the word church at the end of every adjective. And I think in some respects, you might think this move is a shift closer to the kind of position Alison's defending. Alison, do you have any thoughts on the use of language? And do you think it's important that we do find a shared language for new initiatives?
I think as long as they're initiatives, it really doesn't matter. I mean, this is why it was such a missed journalistic error, that you're describing very, very disparate things at very, very disparate stages. And part of the problem is the short-termism of funding of mission things, which means that people feel pressure on them to move towards more ecclesial formation when you're talking about very, very different things at different stages. So I didn't see any problem, but I do think language matters because, it was a Christian, Marshall McLuhan, who said the medium is the message. And, Christ is the message. We don't have any message that isn't personal and embodied in Christ. And this means that our language has to have that kind of depth to it. It's not an inert medium, so language matters enormously.
Yeah, Will, any further reflections on what's going on underneath that?
I've actually found when I was writing the book, Alison's book, the first book that Alison was part of writing with Andrew Davison, was For the Parish, and it was a book that I loved and found difficult in equal measure, which I think is probably the sign of a good book. Really loved. Basically, I found myself agreeing with so many of the premises there, but probably disagreeing with some of the outworkings of it, which is fine. But that was one of the points, Alison, actually, that
Wittgenstein.
The Wittgenstein stuff around, is the medium the message? To what extent does the church embody her message? In what sense, is there a separation between the gospel and the church, I guess? And I think probably, Alison, my reading is you would want to emphasize that, the closest of those two things, whereas my instinct is more to say the church witnesses to the gospel, but isn't itself and I only say that, it sounds like quite a theoretical conversation, but I think that really cashes out actually in how we imagine the reception of our traditions, say the reception of our church. Can church be reimagined other than what we've received? Is there a message that allows us to form churches in different types, in different ways than the way we've received them? So yeah, I think language is really important, but probably there might be a difference as to how we imagine the language functions in that sense.
Yeah, because for me, we are part of the gospel we proclaim, and the more sinful we are, the more, as W.H. Auden, I think I quote, that even sin is valid as a sign. They're written by thy children with a weak and crooked line. Thy word is ever legible, your meaning unequivocal, and even sin is valid as a sign. So even our sinfulness and our being forgivenness is itself an ecclesial sign. So I don't make this separation between ideal church, wicked church.
Yeah,
she's just as well at the moment.
Yes, exactly.
Alison, one of the things that I was really struck by in Will's report was that there were only five of 900 contexts represented that were from the Anglo-Catholic tradition. Does that surprise you? And what reasons do you think there might be for that number?
Well, there are bad reasons, which is that a number of Catholics don't take mission seriously enough and seem to think that you just do the Eucharist and everything will kind of follow. I've actually written an article about the missional nature of the Eucharist for a thing that Isabel Hamley is publishing, because I do think it can be missional. But, you know, they think you just do it and everyone will come. So there is that. But there's also the fact that often they do things without applying for money. So, for example, St Michael and All Angels Paulsgrove is on a huge council estate, very, very difficult council estate. They have a bath bank. They have they work with people through kind of repair clinics. They work with people through a community garden. But they would see all these as missional initiatives of the church. I think on television I quoted Chris Johnson in the Wakefield area, where he has not one but 2 youth groups at his 2 churches, which have worship within them. Now, if this were an evangelical kind of context, this would be a new worshipping community. He thinks it's just what the parish does. So, you know, the choirs, there's now something called choir church, which I think is hilarious, because, you know, when I was a child, it's what all parishes had. You know, even my working class parish in downtown Portsea had a children's choir, and this was part of its outreach. So there's both some people failing to do it, other people doing it and not doing it within the structures or the way that people are thinking. We did get together for a Catholic mission conference, and we spent one day. This was just before COVID, as I recall, because I gave a talk. And loads of people. In fact, we had to limit the number of people who wanted to come. We didn't get much of a welcome, I have to say. I expected the Archbishop to fall upon us, you know, Catholic mission, this is what we want, do more of it. But, you know, we all felt, as one person said, as if we were a load of Abyssinian dentists. So, you know, we're not always being encouraged. And I hope that Murfield would like to put on another Catholic mission conference. And I hope that that will now happen, so that we can get more Catholic parishes thinking more missionally.
And I wonder if actually there's also, related to the conversation we just had about language, there surely is also a point about the use of language there, that many of the 900 contexts represented might be doing things that are happening in Anglo-Catholic parishes. But they wouldn't describe themselves as new worshipping communities or new worshipping congregations, and so likely are going to go under the radar within diocesan structures and audits of this kind of thing. So when Will spoke to the 11 directors of mission or whoever they were in the diocese, there may have been Anglo-Catholic mission initiatives present, but just a lack of shared language to be able to talk about those things.
That's right.
Will, do you have any further reflections on the place of the Anglo-Catholic tradition within this wider conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this conversation opens up much bigger ones, so it's a really good one to have. I think the language is really important. I do say in the report, in the theological reflection, that if we continue to use language like new worshipping communities, it's going to just necessarily be difficult for certain parts of the church to engage. I think we need to be realistic about that. So I think, I mean, this, Alison, I guess you're speaking more from your own house. I'm sort of looking in from the outside. I think there probably are cultural reasons, and I think it's important to recognise the role of culture in our ecclesiology, and to just recognise that it might just be that the culture of training institutions, the culture of Anglo-Catholic networks, whatever, there needs to be some analysis there, would be my observation. So there's something there. There was a time where mission was all done by Catholics because there was only the Catholic Church, and so I think there's probably a reclaiming, it seems to me, of you know, whether it's Aidan and Cuthbert up here in the northeast, you know, where there was these separations that we've created just didn't exist. You know, radically evangelistic, radically Pentecostal, you could argue, and radically sort of Catholic in the sense of liturgical forms matter, our inherited tradition matter. The Catholicity of the church matters. I think in terms of, there's also something here for evangelicals to pay attention to, and in the way in which mission is often presented and described, and that sort of rallying cry of managerialism and that kind of thing at the church. I'm resistant to that in lots of ways, but I am sympathetic to it in others, because I think some of the time, speaking as an evangelical, the way we talk about mission just isn't sort of helpful. There is a sort of functionality to it, a sort of talk about strategy in the wrong way. I think it's a helpful way to talk about strategy, but in the wrong kind of ways, a drawing on other forms which aren't necessarily a sort of an unwillingness to engage with the tradition, but that sort of functionalism of mission, that just for a more sort of Catholically minded or Catholic instinct is just difficult to grasp. It's sort of modernity without being baptized properly, and that's not been helpful. So I think on both sides there needs to be some close introspection.
And Anglo-Catholics need to learn from evangelicals, but as you say, we need some kind of shared language where we all feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, just put it simply, if you care about the Mass, if you think that people encounter Christ in the Mass, that Christ is, why would you not want as many people as possible to be there? And why would you not be going out of your way to find ways for people to engage in that act? Yeah.
I mean, they are. I spoke to one Catholic priest, Anglo-Catholic priest recently. He was on holiday in Marbella, and they have these wonderful sunsets, and everybody goes to look at them on the beach. And he felt, I need to celebrate the Eucharist, and he got a friend, so he had a congregation. So they just on the rocks in their beach clothes started celebrating the Eucharist, and loads of people came, and 40 people received. You know,
it's a fresh expression, Alison.
But you know, it shows you can do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's just to point forwards to some of the work that we're doing at the centre. One of the pieces of research we're doing at the moment is to explore the place of Eucharist within new worshipping communities. That report will hopefully be coming out in the new year. But just as a kind of sneak preview, one of the things that's really striking to me in the context that we've engaged with is that most of the people that responded to the survey in new worshipping communities of some form wanted to find a way to celebrate the Eucharist, which surprised me, and actually spoke in really profound ways about the importance of the Eucharist for mission. One of the challenges that people face in these contexts were in a context which had started with a kind of really contextual framework for thinking about how to gather people, they suddenly found that to bring in liturgy from Common Worship or the Book of Common Prayer just really jarred with the kind of contextual style of worship that they'd created within that context. And I think that's where some of these questions are asking some really fundamental questions about Anglican identity and Anglican ecclesiology. And if these contexts do indeed kind of run separate from the parish, I wonder what that trajectory is for them to become Eucharistic churches, if that's possible. This is a bit cruel because I didn't prep you on this, Alison, but I wonder if you have any reflections about, and I'm going to open this up to wider conversation in a minute if you want to start formulating questions. But let's just end with, do you have any reflections on celebrating the Eucharist within these non-parochial communities?
Well, the thing is that common worship is so broad that as long as you've got the Eucharistic prayer, which is the words of Christ from the Bible, you can do almost anything with the rest of it and still be within authorized. You know, I don't think we're forcing. And, you know, you can bake your own bread and share it. And, you know, you don't have to do. I find that quite strange that people would think that there isn't the freedom given what we've got. Do you know what I mean? Otherwise, you begin to think, you know, you've got the actions and the words of Christ. And you can kind of substitute. So I'm absolutely delighted to hear about people wanting to move towards the Eucharist. That is absolutely fantastic. And we need to help people and to think of ways in which you can develop. I mean, you can start with the kind of the love feast and kind of work from that. And in fact, in my article, I also suggest ways into wake the Eucharist missional is to almost use the Orthodox practice where you have the pax bread for everybody. So you have levels of participation. I don't think there's anything wrong in having levels of participation, because if they're invitational, you know, you're being invited to move to the next. But I think that's just wonderful, and I'm really grateful to you for inviting me into this conversation, because it's teaching me so much. Thank you.
And well, Alison, we'll have to have you back when that report's published, and we can talk more about that then. We have about 15 minutes remaining, and I realise I've been allowed to ask lots of questions, and some of you have been putting questions in the chat, which I'm really grateful for. But I wonder if are there others who would like to ask questions to either Will or to Alison or to both. Please just raise your hand or put your name